Okay. So I'll just mention briefly, my background is mostly I'm in training in economics, and maybe most relevant to this topic, in conflict and in planning. So you've heard a bunch of planning, and in local government. We did some thinking and writing about this a couple of years ago, and wrote some stuff up, and I'm just going to kind of go through a little very quickly sort of what we were thinking about at that period in time a couple of years ago, because part of what we were asked to do, I think, was to try and say, in a sense, update what might have been going on, because there was a flurry of educational activities a few years ago, and it seems like it's dropped off a little. So Ken was asking that. So I went back and looked at what was I thinking a couple of years ago, and now I changed my mind very much and learned a bunch of new things. And I would say a little bit, but actually there hasn't been to use the terminology of the day, a game changer in knowledge that I'm aware of about from a couple of years ago, at least particularly in the areas that I think about. But we are still very much on the learning. Even though I'm an economist, I deal with social effects primarily. One of the conclusions that we came to very earlier, and I'm going to emphasize this in the little bit I'm presenting now, is that if I want to understand what was going to happen to the economy, I had to understand some things I didn't know very much about at all to start with, which was the pace, scale, and location of drilling. Most of us have not studied this industry or how it unfolded in the past here in New York, so we had a lot to learn about that, and we're still learning a lot about that. And there's still a fair amount of uncertainty about what's going to be happening in the future, but we do have, particularly in Pennsylvania, some track record now to look at. I'm going to skip this other part because it's just about things I think about in terms of economics, and I want to finish relatively soon that we can open up the door more to question and answer, but I can talk about more about economics if that's a topic that's of interest to you, but I'm not going to focus on that right now. So, one of the first things we had to try to figure out was, where is this going to happen? How many of you feel pretty confident about that? You know. Steve in the back, very confident man. Who's the only one? So this is, early on, this is coming out of the state, in general, there's information to SGICE, there's information from there's some information from industry, there's information from the geologists in the state. Anyway, these are probably pretty familiar looking pictures, right? Show a pretty broad extent of both the Marcellus and the Utica, focused on the southern tier. There's a bunch of factors that go into this, and the takeaway is, I'm not a geologist, so I'm not actually presenting this as something that I have authority to tell you what's right or wrong. I'm just sort of saying the kind of information that we in the social sciences need in order to be able to do our job well. This is some more recent information. This came out in the past couple months. Over here, we have Terry Gelder's work. There's just, those of you who don't know, he probably was the scientist more responsible than any other about bringing Marcellus into the public arena because of predictions about how much gas was there. So there's a lot of information here, but you can't really see, this is New York right here. What you'll see is his initial predictions from a few years back that show, we're kind of on the edge of the area which had the highest quality gas. These areas with the most are the red areas. And he's basically saying, if I look at the data that's come up from Pennsylvania, I was right pretty well. I predicted pretty well where the gas was going to be coming out of the ground. If you look at the production that's come out of Pennsylvania wells, most of the big numbers in the year are from the counties where I said there would be big numbers. Over here was a guy named Jerry Acton, who is very much of a critic of the idea of how much gas there is. Gave a presentation in Tompkins County that's been out on the internet, and he's coming to the conclusion basically that there's been an exaggeration. There have been other people who have been critics, saying there's been an exaggeration of how much gas is out there. And so the little green area here, right around here, is pretty much where he's saying, based on some projections that he's done, looking at production data from Pennsylvania and various factors that influence production, where you'd be most likely to see the most gas from the Marcellus in particular. So my point is not necessarily that either of these is right or wrong. I think from my perspective as a layperson in terms of geology, there's still uncertainty about that until they've actually started drilling in New York. But there's still, and I don't think these things are even exactly contradictory, but they sort of look at the same information from pretty different perspectives. And this is a very positive perspective. One thing you'll notice, well, you probably won't notice, but it says that this assumes some of these production numbers, they show that the wells, one of the things he does emphasize that the wells over here, that the wells that have been drilled are profitable in the Marcellus, which is not true in all of the other shale plays where the price is very low. You know, there is consensus, if you will, that we're not in the sweet spots as they, we're not likely to be in the sweet spot, if you will, out here in New York, between both of these. Exactly how profitable it's going to be, how much drilling is going to happen, I think there's differences of opinion about that, but you can go, I would say at this point, whichever analyst sort of fits your predilection better until they start drilling here more. I'm going to just emphasize again, the pace, scale, and location are really critical to understand the economic impacts. And money, from an economic perspective, some money does start flowing when leasing happens, as those of you who are landowners don't, but the big money doesn't start coming in until the drilling and the production happens. Most impacts are driven by the drilling patterns. Not all of them, but many of them are driven by where the drilling actually happens. This was an image that many of us, particularly those of us in the background, had about what was going to be like. And some of this was from looking at patterns of drilling out in Colorado and some in Texas. One of the places what you see here is this kind of grid pattern of drilling spread out over the entire landscape. This was like very exciting for those people who saw money in every one of those holes. It was very scary for those people who saw water contamination in every one of those holes. This is again Terry Engelbert's work, and his assumption, this is back in 2008, was that 70% of the section is about a square mile, basically, in each county would be accessible, and a well spacing would be at 80 acres. So compare that with what you know about reality. That's very much like that previous grid pattern assumption that I just showed you. This is what, this is a little old now, but this is what we saw in the early years of drilling in Pennsylvania County. And what I see out of this is a lot more linearity than grid pattern. That's not to say that there won't be infill later, I'm sure there will be, but there's a very different sense of how drilling was going to be unrolled, and I think some of those early images were like what was going to happen. And you know, there's a bunch of reasons for this. It have to do a lot with access and where leases were able to be signed in Pennsylvania. Another thing that happened, there was an image of this so-called manufacturing model throughout all the 95,000 square miles of the Marcellus. There would just sort of be, every hole you drilled in the ground would produce the same amount of gas, they'd all be profitable. Well, the experience in other plays, which appears, at least in the short run, to be coming true in the Marcellus region, is that there are core areas or sweet spots where the drilling gets concentrated. They tend to be at a couple of counties scale. So this is, I think, from the Barnett. This is just existing wells, you know, where they're doing. So very heavy concentration in small areas. This is, I think, goes through the end of 2012 from Pennsylvania. So just a standard map of where drilling is happening there. And again, I think if you look at it, you obviously see the well-known concentrations up here in the north and down in the southwest. A little other concentration over here. But again, I think you could look at these closely, and different colors are just the different years in which those wells were drilled. If you look at it closely, I think you'll see, continuing up until this point, more linearity in the features than grid pattern on the features, even though it may be a little hard to see here. Except on very small scales, there's obviously some fairly intense saturation. Just a reminder about how important price is and what happens. Although sometimes it's not the only factor which determines what gets drilled where, but it's a very important factor. So this is the history from 07 through 13 of what's happened to one of the main indicator prices. And you'll see, this is when all the leasing was happening, right? When the price was super high. It's crashed, it's started to go up again a little, it's kind of been stable recently. One other thing that you might just be interested, this is from the federal government. One other thing you'll notice is look what's happened here with this horizontal drilling as a proportion of natural gas production. It's almost all horizontal drilling now. That's where we're getting our gas. This is natural. I thought I'd take a quick look at the rigs, the data about the rigs before I came here too, because that kind of keeps us up to date. This is put out very frequently. And again, if you're looking at impacts, both environmental and economic, the rig activity is a critical parameter to understand because that's the drilling rigs going out and actually drilling the holes that make it possible to get the gas out of the ground. And you're going to see here some evidence that we had a recession, pretty big. The other thing you're going to see is, again, this story of horizontal drilling here, really being dominant. And also, this trend is up except for this spike. And then maybe just last a little bit. This is national data again. And so one of the things to pay attention to is where are the rigs, right? This is overall in the U.S. There's a relatively stable number of rigs, but they're not always working in the same communities. That's really important to understand the impacts. So here is rig activity by basin, and there's a lot of information here. One of the key things to look at is where is the, I think this one's where the Marcellus go. Boom. This one right here. There was some decline in rig activity here, a little bit of recent pickup, but this is one of the major areas of activity in the entire country in terms of gas drilling. This is just gas rigs. Now, I don't know a huge amount about this, but I've also been told as time has gone on, it's become harder and harder to sort of, particularly as wet gas has become more important, it's become harder and harder to distinguish in these counts between rigs that are truly just gas versus rigs that are truly just oil. So there's a little bit of fuzziness in the distinctions between the gas rigs, which I'm talking about here, and oil rigs, which are the remainder. Another thing to look at, gas rigs as a percent of total, so most of the other ones are the rigs that are going primarily after oil plays. And Marcellus is one of the few plays of these major plays, major gas plays in Haynesville, another one where it's almost all gas, not much oil. All these other ones, there's been a lot of shifting around from gas to oil in that direction mostly. Just a reminder, and then I think I'm about done here. Not everything happens at once. Thinking about the sequencing of what happens is very important. So some things are very short run, like the drilling. This earlier folks made this point in a different way. The well pads, the drilling, that's relatively short run kind of impact on the community, depending on what happens on those pads. But it's designed to be a short run event. And all these other things are in place for much longer periods, and they're servicing more a regional arena than a specific pad. So, you get the longer terms. All of these things are servicing multiple wells. And they get drilled, they get fracked, they're active production, while other ones are being drilled, et cetera, et cetera. So there's sequencing going on here within a community, and if you're thinking about the community as a whole, you're going to think about different sets of activities and types of impacts than if you're just thinking about a single path. So, another way to think about phasing, about the development of the entire field, this is actually from the Joni Haddockline, one of our colleagues, Jeffrey Duquette, put this out to jobs. There's a lot more labor involved in the early phases of the development of the field than in the later production and reclamation phases. A lot more. Just a quick reference to some work that Jeffrey and I will have coming out in a few moments, just trying to sort of like remind ourselves, in a sense, at least in academia, I don't know about the general public, about there's this notion, which I think is very important to understand, that there being booms and busts in this economy. In the oil and gas economy, we've already seen that happening to some extent. But a lot of us fall back on models of boom and bust from the 1970s, which is when there was a lot of attention given to this issue, particularly around energy and particularly in the West. And a lot of the things that we learned there, I'm not going to go into this unless you want me to later, but a lot of the things that we learned there that we made as assumptions aren't really nearly as true in the modern economy, particularly here in the Northeast, where the situation is very different. So assumptions about rurality, about how isolated the extraction activity is and the communities are, about how concentrated they are in, around a mine or something like that, or a single oil field, around who owns the property. The West doesn't have the same kind of landowner patterns as we do out here in the Northeast, around economic development corporate behavior, particularly around the financialization, the importance of financial instruments and capital flows in financing these deals changed dramatically